Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for Red Giant TV. In this multi-dimensional episode of Red Giant TV, designer Harry Frank is going to walk you through creating a 3D environment from a 2D image, all in After Effects. This won't be using traditional camera projection techniques, nor will it use vanishing point in Photoshop. Instead, Harry's figured out a technique for warping images to build 3D layers. You'll also learn some great compositing and color correction techniques to finish the job off right. Take it away, Harry.
Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and in this tutorial we'll be using some green screen footage, doing a 3D track and key on this, and then we'll replace the background with a still frame photograph. But because there's a camera move, we're actually going to need this photograph to exist as a 3D environment. And this is going to happen by using a plugin called Red Giant Warp, and we'll properly distort and skew these images and place them in 3D space so that we can actually reassemble this alleyway here. So you can get a feel for how to do this on your own with your own shots. However, for this lesson, you'll actually be able to download this footage from hollywoodcamerawork.us, which is where I got this, and go to their page, greenscreenplates.html. You'll actually find the shot that we're using as the very first shot on the page, although there's a bunch more that you'll find on here. Take note of the tech specs here. We are using a 1280 by 1080 source clip here because this was shot on DVC Pro HD. And it says right here in their tech specs, it's laid out for you, the 1080p plates have a pixel aspect of 1.5 to 1. So when you download and import these image sequences, make sure to go to the interpret footage function and define that pixel aspect. I've already done that and actually output a QuickTime with a ProRes codec, so I just have one QuickTime that I can carry around and use for demo purposes. So to get this started, the first thing I'm going to do is a track on this. I'm going to use the Foundry's camera tracker. So to get that, you'll actually have to go to thefoundry.co.uk, go to products/camera tracker. This is a 3D camera tracker and match mover for After Effects, and it's phenomenal. I love it. It's one of those things that I don't know how I got along without it. So I've got a basic track already done with this, but I'll show you exactly how to get this set up. So I'll turn these track layers off and drop a fresh version of the footage in here. Go to Effect, Foundry, or the Foundry, Camera Tracker 1.0. I don't really even need to change any of the default features with this track. From experience, I've found that it really tracks just fine. So I'm going to click on Track Features, and it's going to go all the way forward and all the way to the end, and then back all the way to the beginning of the clip. So this will take about a minute or so. So once it completes that, you can see that we've got all the tracking points in here, and we're all set to solve the camera. Shows us a reprojection error here, and you want to keep that low. Below 3.0 is pretty good, so 1.46 seems to be pretty good here. Now, before we create the camera, we should define two things. We should define where the ground plane exists, because camera trackers only calculate relative camera movement. They don't know exactly where the ground is. And we should also define where the point of origin is. And I'm going to use this toe right here on her right foot. So first things first, let's define where the ground plane is. Now we've got some markers here along the floor, so I can select all of these. In fact, let me select the toe there, grab a couple of these, and this one right here. So I'm just holding down the Shift key and selecting these different points. And I can go to the ground plane and set that to the selected ground plane area. You can see those are highlighted now. So when I create my camera data, that is going to be where my X and Z planes pass through. I also need to set my point of origin, so I can select this one little point right here. Just by clicking on it, go to ground plane and say set origin. So now when I create my camera, just by clicking on create scene, we have a null object right there. And that null object is at a center point for the scene at 640 by 360 by 0. And as we move around, We can see that this 3D null in After Effects moves with the motion of the camera, and it's done a pretty good track. All right, let me just delete these others that I've done here. Now, at this point, what I'd recommend, if you are happy with this, is to save a backup copy. And delete the camera tracker plugin. The reason is all of that data actually takes up quite a bit of room, and it's stored in the After Effects project itself. And it can really balloon the size of your project. And your saves, your autosaves can start taking quite a bit of time. So the camera data and tracker, the null object, are all here, and we're ready to go. So at this point, let's start pulling a key off of this. So I'm going to use Primat Keyer. Primat Keyer is great, and as I always say, especially as a motion designer by trade myself, I mostly do motion design, and that's what I professionally have done for years. And compositing and visual effects is just something that's sort of come after the fact. So I've never really considered myself any sort of master compositor or keying expert. I've just done it a lot. But what I found with Primat Keyer is that the interface is designed around the challenges you experience when trying to pull a key, especially one like this where you've got a lot of spill and it's a little bit fuzzy because of either the footage type being DVC Pro, or maybe the focus was a little soft. So we're going to define the background by using this tool right here. See, it's highlighted in red. So we click on this. I can click one point or a series of points by dragging to select the initial background color. And if I hold on Alt or Option 4, we can toggle back and forth between the alpha channel. In fact, I often just leave it set to the alpha channel itself as we do this. We can still leave it as the alpha channel and do our keying here. So you can see we've got these markers that are actually in green, but they're still showing up. And we've got some shadowing and unevenness on the floor. So I'm going to go to the next tool here, Clean Background. And I'll set this to a rectangular selection rather than a point. So I can just start highlighting whole areas to key out. Actually, you're doing a pretty good job just by taking two little swipes of the rectangle. So now we can see we have some gray areas in the foreground of the subject. So I'm going to go to Clean Foreground and select the inside like that. Now I've not done any sort of garbage matte or anything like that, so we see a little bit of noise here and there. I'm not going to be too concerned about that because most of that's going to go away in doing a garbage matte. More what I'm concerned about are some of these inside shadows right here coming from the spill. So let me go back to a point selection. Select some of these areas here towards the edge of the jacket. Try to get a pretty clean key. So now if we switch back to the RGB view, although we've got a pretty decent matte going, we can see that we've got a considerable amount of spill where the background reflects onto the foreground. But I'm pretty happy with the matte so far, although we are going to clean it up just a little bit more. But rather than fight with the foreground and background, I'm going to deal with the problem at hand, which is that I've got spill in my foreground area. And there's a tool built into Primat to deal with exactly that problem. So if I go into the composite controls, I can twirl open Spill Killer. I'm going to set my color mode to green and click on Enable. Although it's looking fairly good, I mentioned the edges aren't exactly as clean as they could possibly be. Now, again, we're dealing with some pretty challenging footage where the edges are a bit fuzzy. But Primat's got one more trick up its sleeve. Right now, we're doing one continuous pass over this whole image. So the edges and the fill are all being processed at the same time, even though the edges and the fill have different issues to tackle. There's actually a way to separate the edges and fill in the keying process. So if we go into keying, refinement, it's a little bit buried, and under advanced, there's this hybrid on and off checkbox. This has Primat separate the keying process into the edge and fill. Now, when I turn this on, it's going to start to look a little bit fuzzy. We need to do some adjustment here. I'm going to turn the hybrid blur. This is the blurred area of the matte, or the blurring of the matte that we are defining to separate the edge. So I'm going to use a pretty narrow area. I'm also going to turn down the erode value. There we go. Now, one more thing I might do is once we get into the compositing process is put a little bit of a light wrap or perhaps edge blur. In fact, right now I can put some edge blur on here, going into key correct and select edge blur. And I'm going to turn this down maybe to about 2 pixels wide and a 2 pixel blur. Doesn't need to be very harsh. Just needs to smooth out those edges. I think we're doing pretty good here. Now, if I'd like to check my skin tones, I can actually lay Magic Bullet Cosmo on top of this, and exactly what is it supposed to do? Is it supposed to look at color ranges and check to see if our color is in a safe skin tone range? So if I show the skin tone overlay, there should be a grid showing me exactly where skin tones are. I'm actually not really seeing a whole lot. So let me take the skin color and push it one way or the other. There we go. So if I push it a little more towards red, we can see the skin tone grid start to pop up on the legs and on the face. In fact, I can squeeze these colors together so that we have less of a color variance in the image. So there, let me uncheck that. And looks just a touch dark, so I'm going to lay just Colorista Free on here. We only need a 3 color corrector for this, so I'm going to push the midtones up just a little bit. In fact, it's probably a good idea to put my color correction before Cosmo so I can check that my color correction is not affecting my skin tones. It actually looks like it is just a little bit. There, push the saturation up just a little bit. There, feeling pretty good about that. Now again, we're generating a composite here, so I'm definitely going to come back to this, but we've got our key pretty well set up. But before I get too far, let's just do a little bit of a garbage matte on this. So I'm going to draw a matte around the foreground and just make sure that this stays with the camera motion. In fact, I'm going to take this point, bring it up a little bit, bring this one down, bring these in, and do a quick keyframe there, and go to the end. There we go. So I got my garbage matte in place, so none of the set pieces or extraneous noise that I didn't key out on the edges will be showing up. I've got my fairly decent key going on here, a little bit of color correction, and now it's time to start laying in the background. So if we toggle our effects chain on and off, we can see we've done a pretty good job of isolating the foreground and background, removing the spill, even in areas like in the cheek there where it reflected, or on the legs. And we've made a pretty good matte despite the blurriness of the source footage. And we've done some color correction to make sure that we've preserved the skin tones and pushed the color ranges into a fairly decent area, so everything is nice and bright. So we've tracked it and keyed it, so now let's start to construct the environment that will surround our subject here. So I'm going to start with just a basic floor reference. I always do this when I'm doing a 3D track, is I make just a square solid, and I lay a grid on it. So I'm going to go to Generate Grid, make it 3D. I'm going to parent this to this null object right here. In fact, let me just rename this to Origin, because that way I know that that null object right there is the origin of my scene. So I'll parent it to that origin. This should be at 0, 0, 0. So it's centered right at that origin. And let's do some rotation here so that it's actually flat along the ground. And let's squeeze the grid together. There we go. And put it below our subject. Now, before we get too far here, I want to point something out to you. Something that you should check before we get too far into our composite. Because there's a point at which it becomes a little too late to fix this this problem. Not even a problem, just something you might not even be thinking about at this point. But I'm going to create a solid that's just any random color and put it in our scene, make it 3D. And I'm going to toggle open the position controls here. Now, the way we're facing right now, the way the camera is facing, forward and back, should be Z space, right? So if I move my solid in Z, it's actually going side to side. And if I move X, it's going front to back. There's nothing exactly wrong with this. It's just how the camera tracker tracked the scene. We defined the floor area and the point of origin, but there's really no defining of where the forward direction really is in 3D space when you're using a camera tracker. And this is one of the reasons that by default, camera tracker actually creates a null object that the camera is parented to. So if I go into this null object here, go to Y rotation, push it 90 degrees. Now I should be able to move my objects in X and Z without problem. So as we do particle work and all that, it's just going to get really confusing if X and Z are actually backwards. This will save you some headaches in the long run. All right, so let's create the left wall over on this side. I mentioned we're going to be doing this with a still image and using a corner pinning tool from Red Giant Warp. So let me drag this image in. Let's not make it a 3D layer just yet. Just scale it down. Now, you're probably familiar with traditional corner pins. In fact, there's one built into After Effects that does some pretty basic corner pinning. And essentially what we do is just take an image and skew it so that it conforms to 4 sets of new points that tell the image where to pin to. So we start from this image and we pin it to this image. There's also another nice one from Psycore called Power Pin. Has some more options in it. We can pin it like that. Actually, you can see that moves a little bit quicker than the After Effects Power Pin. It also allows us to do stuff like this where we can grab the corners like that and also freely move things around with all 4 points at the same time. Still not a whole lot of control. It's lacking a lot of different things, numeric control over the perspective shift, or there's no rotation controls, there's no motion blur, that kind of thing. So if we go to Red Giant Warp, apply Red Giant Corner Pin, there's a lot more control we got with Red Giant Corner Pin than the others that we have available. First main difference is that RG Corner Pin does not assume that you're starting from a square shape. So we have an image shape that we can define as our starting point and then where we're pinning to. So you'll see in the interface that we have from and to pinning points that we can define. So the from points in this wall are going to be the shape of this first wall and this wall here. And then where we're pinning it to is a square shape, because the wall essentially is one big square shape. Rectangular shape if you want. There's also some very cool stuff in here for translating X and Y numerically, scaling X and Y freely, rotating them, control over motion blur, that kind of stuff. There's Mocha importing, all kinds of good stuff in here. So I'm going to show my from pins because I want to pin from this wall shape. And my view mode right now is actually warping, and I don't want it to do that. I'm just going to set it to view the original image. So I can grab my from pinning points here and define the shape of this wall. Let's go in here and just sort of get that first wall shape. I don't want the sidewalk because that's part of the ground plane. So that's my pinning from point. and I am going to tell it to pin it, or pin the from pins. I know it's kind of an awkward wording that the from pins warp. We are warping the 4 pins that are the from points, the from image. Now I'm going to make this a 3D layer. And now that my X and Z are actually in the correct perspective, I can move the Z position back, and let's rotate this in the correct manner, which would be in the negative direction. I'll set this to -90. And let me turn that grid back on. This is actually going to help me quite a bit. So let's move that over there. Okay, so if I move my camera around, we can see that we are totally not in the right space. This is where our grid is going to help us align things. But for my 3D layers to actually interact, I need to put this one layer immediately above my grid, so I don't have any two-dimensional layers like this, the footage, breaking the 3D render engine. So first thing I'm going to keep my eye on is where the grid, which is the floor location, and the wall are actually intersecting. So I want that to be the bottom of where my grid intersects. And put that right there. Let's see how far over my camera view comes. Shift this forward and make the alley just a little bit bigger. Something like that. Now we're in much better location. Let's call this the left wall. Guess it depends on whose perspective it is, but I'm going to call it my perspective. Let's duplicate that and we'll make a right wall. Show P and shift this one over quite a bit to make sure that the camera doesn't actually go behind where the wall is and just comes to the edge of it. So I need to scooch that over an X just a touch so that when the camera ends, it's not hitting that wall. Okay, now I actually need to go back into my corner pinning tools. Scale this down just a little bit and have this fit the window. We are showing our from pins, and I want to set this back to the original view and make sure I'm showing my RG corner pin in my view there. So now I need to switch these pinning points to the other wall. So let's just grab this one like that. Just move these pinning points over to the other side so that we can pin this other wall. Oops, I grabbed the wrong point. So we've got the right wall. Let's have it pin from. So now we can see that we've got the other side. I can move all these back just a little bit, make the alley a little bit wider. Now these are scaled, so I do have some flexibility in scale size. So I can make these a little bit bigger and move them up so that they touch the ground. Now I should be able to move these both in Z. There we go. Now the back wall is basically going to be the front, the straight-on projection of the image. So if I duplicate this, call this the back wall, I can simply remove RG corner pin from that, rotate it straight on, move this back in Z space all the way back there, and scale it up so that we get kind of where the alleyway should stop. There we go. And I'm just going to mask out the additional stuff. Now to get this all to match in nicely, we'll be adding some additional compositing tricks. There'll be some depth of field and some lighting and all that in here. So this will start to come together a little bit better than it is right now. We're just kind of roughing in the shapes. Okay, now let's get the floor in. Let's grab our photograph, drop it into the comp. I'll solo it for now, apply RG corner pin, show original, and show our from pins. Also, scale it down. So I want to isolate the road, but this is actually going to be trickier than you might think. So I want to make sure to not get these dumpsters back here, because as we get into these very distant points where we include this as our from pinning, we're going to have some really stretched out dumpsters at these distant points. So I'll pull this just outside a little bit. These areas will obviously be cropped. It's not going to make any imagery that doesn't exist. Basically what it's going to do is just sort of angle that, or skew the angle along with the pinning. So I'm going to include some of this sidewalk in here and try to minimize how many, the amount of the dumpsters that we've got in here. There. We'll try that. Let's go to 3D switch for that layer and set the view mode to from pins warp. Let's rotate this into place. Set this to -90 and hit P, push this way back in Z. See, now I said this one was a little trickier because you might be saying, this looks absolutely nothing like a road, and it really doesn't at this point. So we have to do some creative rotation and placement so that this actually starts to fit. So I'm going to unlock my scale it out quite a bit, and unsolo this so we can actually start to position this with the rest of the layers. There, now it's starting to look something like an alleyway road. Let's show our position so we can start to scale this to fit. We can scale X and Y independently. Actually, let's scale it down a little bit and move that back. What I found that works best is using two different layers, because this very skewed layer, although works well to sort of establish the distant alleyway road, as it gets closer to the camera, we start to lose some of that detail. So I'm going to call this the road rear, and then I'm going to do a road front. And on this rear, or the front layer, I'm actually just going to remove corner pin and bring this right up the front. As the camera was close to the original alleyway in the original photograph, I think it actually kind of works if we scale it and position it the right way. And actually we've got a nice little reference here, which is a circular manhole cover. So I can position this as I see fit. Maybe I want her actually standing right on the manhole cover. Scale that up and outward. Let's just do a little bit of masking on here. So we just isolate this to this front area. Do a little bit of feather on it. And I just gotta mix these two layers together. Mix these together. So where this rear one is, let's show our original. I think I need to get a little bit more of this darker area here. I'm going to bring this from points forward just a little bit more so we get this darker texture of the alleyway. Show our from pins. There we go. So I get a little smoother of a transition in here. We keep adjusting until it doesn't suck. So this isn't blending quite as nicely as I'd like. I'm going to try one more thing where I'll just flip the order of these so that I've got the larger one on top and I've got a little bit of extra stuff to play with here. But to blend these together and smooth them out, I can't exactly use a mask because the mask is going to be before the effect, and the effects are going to pin from the masked area. So to feather this out, I'm actually going to use a transition linear wipe. Set this to 0 degrees and pull the transition completion up just a little bit and start feathering this quite a bit. Yeah, the feather is a little too heavy on that. It's starting to look a little bit better. Now as we darken this and add our depth of field and all that, some of these edges and all that will start to fade and blend in just a little bit better. I am seeing a little gap over here, so I want to push that out. Okay, so just for reference, let's throw a light in here and see how lighting affects these layers. Let's move this all the way to the back. We can see we can move it along, we can move it upward, give some effective lighting, start to darken some of these areas so it actually starts to look more like a dark alleyway. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that I haven't even touched in terms of compositing the foreground and the background, but now that we actually have our background in, or our composited background, we can actually revisit our composite and do a couple more things here. So, in the composite controls, I can define a background layer. So let's just pick any of these images here. It's just going to look at the undistorted, unskewed, untransformed image. So any of these right wall or back wall images will be just fine. So I can define that as my layer, and I can go into my color matcher and enable color matching. So what it's going to do is look at that layer that I've defined, average the colors together, and push that color into our subject. Now, little bit strong by default, so let's just pull the strength down maybe 15 or so. So if you're looking at it at this point and thinking that it looks a little bit rough, keep in mind that we are going to add quite a bit of light and fog and depth of field and stuff like that to really start to add the smoke and mirrors to obscure some of these things. So let's get to adding the lens flare that I'll attach to one of these street lights up here. Let's create a light. I'm going to call this a street light. And I don't want this affecting anything. I just want this as a three-dimensional location. So I'm going to make it an adjustment light and put this at the bottom. This way it's not going to affect any of my 3D layers, but I'll still be able to see where the light is. Now I know in Z space where I want the light to be, which is on this back wall. So I'm going to copy that Z value and go to my light and paste it right there. So now I know exactly where in Z space that that light is supposed to be, and I only have to worry about these two other axes, so I can eyeball this, just like so. So now as this tracks around, this should be pretty well locked to where that image of the street lamp is. All right. Now with that light selected, I can simply go to Null 3D Flare. And I'm going to create my light factory layer and link the flare to that layer. Now the flare itself is definitely not fitting with the scene, so let's go into our options, open up the lens designer. I'm just going to load one from the cinematic flares presets, which is a set of 100 presets that I designed. It's one of the guru presets available from Red Giant. And let's use something like digital gold. I'm just going to disable the depth scaling and just manually set my intensity scale, because there isn't a whole lot of front and back movement, so I can just sort of eyeball how I'd like this light to look. Now maybe I'd like another street lamp, so let's duplicate that, street light number 2, and position that. And line it up with that light right there. Let's do the same thing. All 3D flare, create and link flare, and I'll load that last preset. I'll leave this one pretty dim. Well, I guess I'll leave the depth scaling on for that one. So I got my 2 flare points in the background, and let's actually start to manipulate some of the lighting here. So I'll move it back in Z-space towards that back wall. You can tell when I hit the back wall, when the back wall goes dark. And I'll bring it forward just a little bit, maybe move it up. Just kind of looking for that moody lighting that makes it look like kind of a dark alleyway. Now I can adjust these individual walls too. So I'll select this. Let me lock these 2 layers here so I can just click on that left wall. Hit AA to show my material options. I'll bring the diffuse down, as well as the specular. So I'm kind of darken that wall up just a little bit. Maybe same goes with the back wall. Turn down the specular a little bit, and the diffuse. Let's go into our camera, turn on depth of field. And I still have that grid on from my original setup here, so I think it's time to turn that thing off. That's the little funny white spots you see inside there. Now I need to check my focus point because it is not in focus where my my lady is actually standing. So let me go into my focus distance here and try to get that focus spot right to where she is standing. Basically, I'm looking at the manhole cover here and trying to get that in focus. Getting pretty close. Maybe the aperture can come down just a little bit so we don't have so much blur going on in the background. Now let's add a little bit of fog, and I think we'll probably be pretty good. So let's create a new layer for our fog. Doesn't matter, but I'm going to make the layer black, and I'll make it the comp size. That does matter. So go to Effect, Trap Code Particular, and move the emitter back in Z-space. See, this is where things matter in Z, and when we made that initial correction to our X and Z. So let's do a box emitter instead of that point emitter and crank up the size of the X. And actually, let's set the velocity to 0. It's going to make it a lot easier to see that box area. So let's turn that up. Move it forward just a little bit in Z-space. Basically, I'm looking to fill the alleyway with particles. And how tall is kind of up to you. You know, if you want it concentrated more towards the ground, I'm going to move it upward, kind of fill the whole area. So let's go into the particle type. I'll set this to a cloudlet, crank up the size, set the opacity to a very low value, like 0.5, and maybe up the particle count. We'll say 250 particles per second. Now, just so we don't see the particles popping on and off, we'll go to opacity over life, have them fade up and down over life, as well as lengthen the lifespan. Maybe I'll set this to 6 seconds. And actually, I should always make sure that my flares are on the topmost layers, because the lens flares happen inside the camera. So they should be one of the last things that happen in the process. Therefore, I'll put it at the top. Just one of those things I always have to remind myself to do. Now, last thing, I'm just going to put a little bit of shine in here. And this is going to add some volumetric light. So let's go to Track Code Shine. I'll just get some of my initial settings here. I'm going to use an adjustment layer, set the blending mode to normal, shine opacity, maybe 33 or so. Colorize, we'll set this to 1 color, and I'll use something kind of golden. And we'll use a bit of a expression to tie the location of the source point in 3D, or act as if it is 3D. So I'll tie it to the streetlight position. So let's tap tilde here, go to my shine and Alt or Option click on the source point and pick whip that light, just the light layer. And type period, lowercase t-o, capital C-O-M-P, parentheses, start bracket, 0, 0, 0, right bracket, and parentheses. 2cont basically ties the equivalent 2-dimensional position from a 3-dimensional source, starting at the upper left corner, which is 0, 0, 0. Well, light has basically 1 point source, so it doesn't really matter. But we do have to define that those 3 points. So now I can, boost the light up if I want. I'm going to add a little bit of shimmer in here, just so we see a little bit of the streaks coming through. Not too much. Now we can also set this to the colors to none, and it's just going to absorb the colors from the scene. Now I probably don't want Our Lady with the jacket emitting light, so I can drag this actually below everything else, and just turn up the boost light a little bit so it starts grabbing some volumetric rays from the background. Not quite as effective. Maybe I can put her above the fog, which doesn't really make sense, but I can put the shine above the fog, and that way we'll get some more of those light rays. Maybe I just need to make 2 layers of fog. Probably is the way to go. So let me lower the opacity. This will be fog 1, and put 1 on top here. Call this fog 2, and just to mix things up, I'll set this random seed to a different value. So I have 2 layers of fog doing 2 different things. It's looking a little foggy. Let me set it to 20% or so. Now, the last thing that might be a little bit slightly tedious to do, that I'm not going to do in detail here, but it simply is to add some shadowing around the feet. And this was simply drawn in. Because the feet don't move, we can just draw in a couple shapes where the feet are. So just to do this very crudely, I can make a solid that's, square. Call this foot shadow 1. Make it 3D. It's going to go right where my source center is, which is pretty easy. Flatten that out. And just draw a very basic shape. So let's put this where the foot is. Foot should be projecting a shadow a little bit, probably not that long. Let's soften it up. And bring down the opacity, and obviously put it below the keyed subject. Not exactly in the right spot. Let me shimmy it over. Just kind of roughing it in. And do put shadow number 2, move that over. You get the idea. Now, overall, I think I could use a little color correction on top. Now, you can manually do this. There's a couple different ways. An easy way would just be to use Magic Bullet Mojo. Let's just add a nice amount of punch, especially if you make it an adjustment layer so it actually works. Let's turn up the Mojo, but I'm going to warm it up quite a bit rather than use the cooler default settings. There. So let's turn it off and back on. I think this was a pretty fun tutorial. I had a good time doing it. Hope you learned something. My name's Harry Frank. Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks, Harry. Great job. If you enjoyed this tutorial, check out Harry's site at graymachine.com, where you can find a whole bunch of awesome goodies, including free presets, tutorials, and a link to Harry's fantastic training DVDs like Complete Training for Trapcode Particular or Trapcode Form Training. Also, don't forget to check out Harry's killer Red Giant Guru preset packs, looping backgrounds for Trapcode Suite, cinematic flares for No Light Factory, Video Rock for Particular, weddings for Trapcode Suite, and holidays for Particular. Because hey, it's always that most wonderful time of the year. And by the way, you can get all of those and much more as a part of the Red Giant Guru Suite. Don't forget, you can download a free trial version of the software that Harry used in this tutorial at redgiantsoftware.com, and you can get free presets for Red Giant plugins on redgiantpeople.com. And to keep up with the latest news about new products, tutorials, tips, and deals, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or on our blog. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for RedGiantTV.com. I'll see you next time.